US chipmaker Intel hasn't confirmed the Bloomberg report that Intel is in talks with the US government to take a stake in the company. But if that's true, it would be a major shift when just last week, US President Donald Trump was calling for the resignation of Intel's CEO. So, how big of a comeback would this deal be for that relationship?
But yeah, it would be quite the turnaround if this happens. I think if you look at the broader context, though, remember the Biden administration under the CHIPS Act was essentially exerting indirect control over Intel with the strings that were attached to the money that was to be delivered. So this isn't completely unprecedented, but in the direct way that the rumors are talking about, it's very new.
Even before the calls for resignation, there was some tension between Intel and the White House. Trump has floated the idea of repealing the CHIPS Act, which would send nearly 8 billion US dollars to Intel. If the government does take a stake in the company, do you think the likelihood that they will actually get that money goes up?
I think the likelihood goes up dramatically. Yeah. I think that if the goal is to have the backstop of the federal government and the funding that was promised from the CHIPS Act and more, then this would be a very, very good deal for Intel. The question would be, would this be something where it would be temporary, much like the bailout of General Motors, versus Intel being a strategic part of our strategy for AI moving forward, and a good partner to partner with from a federal government perspective?
Well, there's another firm that's supposed to get CHIPS Act money, and that's Taiwan's TSMC. They're slated to get more than 6 billion for their Arizona facilities. Now, they say they don't need that money, but if I'm sitting at TSMC headquarters and I've just made the largest direct investment in US history, and I hear the US government is taking a stake in my competitor, Intel, how am I feeling right now?
You wouldn't be feeling very good. And in fact, there are a lot of American companies that were very upset by the gesture toward Intel. There's a sense that Intel made its own bed and that it should suffer the consequences of whatever failures it might have had along the way. There's this concept of being too big to fail, too important to fail. For example, there were rivals of Intel who flatly said Taiwan Semiconductor beat Intel at certain games. That's why we choose to use TSMC instead of Intel. Why are we now subsidizing Intel? So no, there will be a lot of people who will be upset, companies that will be upset by this.
All right, Dave, big picture. What's the main question in your mind about this potential Intel deal?
Is the United States pivoting more in the direction of public private partnerships like we're used to seeing in Europe and in some Asian countries that are almost a cultural anathema in the US at this point? A lot of people would be absolutely opposed to this. The big question that's at hand here is AI sufficiently different to warrant this different approach? Is this just a one off, or does this signal a fundamental change in the way government and industry will behave in the US?